Chapter 1. Mare Isla. A low growl accompanied the scratching sound of pen against ruled paper, furiously documenting the lecture on the pyramids of Giza with fierce concentration. Again, the low stutter, followed by an obnoxious snort, interrupted determined scribbling. On that third snore, however, I shut my exercise book, rolled it up nice and neat, then whacked the guy next to me over the head to wake him up. He groaned a bit but didn't stir, so I did what any good person would do. Kicked his seat back into its upright position before sitting down. A quick look around revealed no other sleeping students, just as well. That gave him the rude awakening he deserved as he righted himself and wiped at the drool with the back of his hand. I tried my best to hide my amused smirk whilst unraveling the workbook. Nearby students chuckled low and shared knowing glances. Even those who had been half asleep themselves looked embarrassed for their fellow students' obvious lack of preparation. "Hey," said one of them, "you're lucky you caught him in time." I shrugged off such comments and turned towards the front of the class where our professor stood behind her lectern, arms folded across her chest. Lucky indeed. She was a beautiful woman with a strong jawline, piercing blue almond-shaped eyes, statuesque figure and well-groomed appearance. Yet there was precious little she tolerated from her students, especially when they couldn't be bothered to pay attention. At the end of session, I gathered my things as our professor went through everything we needed for our trip to Egypt in a few days. That was the most exciting thing about archaeology as a major so far, the hands-on experiences they offered us. My whole life I have always been so fascinated with ancient history. That fascination began early enough. As a young child growing up in Chicago, Illinois, I spent every spare moment reading books or watching documentaries about past civilizations. It wasn't just Egyptian culture either, but also Greek and Roman cultures too. What drew me more than anything else were the pyramids. And not only because they were impressive structures, although they certainly were, but because something inside me felt compelled to study everything related to these magnificent monuments. From all angles, whether it was drawings, models, or even photographs taken during excavations, nothing satisfied this craving quite like seeing actual physical objects being unearthed. Seeing how they once might have looked centuries ago, how they still remained intact after millennia of neglect and decay. The fascination with ancient history seemed odd to the other kids. I would often lose them on tangents about the differences and similarities. It made me an outcast among my young peers, so I didn't have many friends. But whenever anyone asked questions about my interests, I could hardly contain myself. In fact, I got downright excited talking about it. So much so, people sometimes called me crazy. When I grew older, my interest in archaeology became apparent to teachers and professors alike, which led to several opportunities for scholarships. The walk home was always one of contemplation. It was quite the trek, and I was by no means athletic, my body being of average weight, but I managed well enough, with the odd trip over my own feet every now and again. It was like the bottle of clumsiness slipped from the hands of whatever higher being created me and tipped the whole thing into my genetic makeup. Or perhaps it was the result of some kind of curse. No matter why, I never thought twice about tripping over a tree root or stubbing my toe on a rock hidden beneath grassy blades. Sometimes I wished I'd inherited more practical talents instead. To further prove my point, while thinking of my clumsiness, my foot caught a crack in the cement and sent me stumbling. I groaned in frustration between regaining my balance so I didn't fall on my ass and covering it up. Over the years, I had mastered the art of making ineptitude look natural. For example, if someone saw me walking along holding onto walls, leaning against trees, or simply using my elbows for support, they wouldn't think twice about it. They probably assumed I was drunk, which isn't exactly unheard of, having trouble balancing due to alcohol intoxication or suffering from vertigo. I would rather look like a toddler that had just found its footing than accept the truth. So, the rest of the way home consisted of an interesting view, that was the floor, to prevent any more concrete surprises. When I reached my apartment complex, I climbed the stairs to the third floor, then walked down the hallway until reaching number 226. A small brown door sat at the very end. There was nothing remarkable about it except for the lack of a doorknob. Instead, the lock protruded directly from the center of the door frame, not what I expected when renting a place in a building full of college students. I pressed my thumb against the scanner next to the handle, allowing access to the inner sanctum. Once inside, I took off my shoes, leaving them neatly lined up alongside each other before closing the door behind me. I flipped on the light switch sitting above the entranceway table, revealing a cozy living room area with 2 large windows facing north overlooking a street corner. An entertainment system rested atop a white couch near the window, accompanied by a matching recliner. 2 tall bookcases filled the opposite wall, containing mostly reference material. Atop the desk, where a laptop resided, there was another lamp, plus a collection of photos hanging beside a wooden plaque displaying names carved into its surface. The kitchen was located across from the entryway. After removing my backpack, I tossed it aside, taking care to make sure none of their contents spilled out. Then I stretched my arms out, arching my back like a cat, and sighed in relief as the sound of clicking joints filled the room. Life was good, to be honest. I had no qualms about how it was going so far. Time passed by faster than I was comfortable with. In the blink of an eye, I was getting ready to leave for the airport. I could see the undeniable excitement in the dark hazel eyes of my reflection. A good enough-looking Portuguese woman with olive skin, a round face, long black hair that reaches the middle of her back in soft curls, and a strong jutting jawline with symmetrical facial features. My favorite feature was the full, long lashes of those upturned eyes. My reflection looked happy, and that made me feel better about everything else. As usual, I wore jeans tucked into boots paired with a simple grey shirt, all topped off with a blue blazer and a neat ponytail. One last check through my closet revealed 3 different sets of luggage, 2 were duffels, one smaller and easier to carry around town, the second larger, meant only for longer trips such as this one. Both suitcases held clothes and toiletries. Once satisfied with both luggage and appearance, I grabbed my bag, slinging the carry-on over my shoulder, and head out to the taxi waiting for me outside my apartment. When we arrived at the airport, I paid the driver and stepped outside, dragging my suitcases after me. I approached a nearby ticket counter, handing the clerk my passport. She glanced briefly at my ID card, then handed back a boarding pass printed with a seat number. The excitement between my fellow students was palpable as we boarded the plane. I caught bits and pieces of their chatter as I settled into my seat for a long and grueling flight. I stared blankly ahead, focusing on the scenery below us, not paying attention to anything else. It wasn't long before the pilot announced our descent. He also informed everyone that we were now entering Cairo airspace. Soon, the sun would set upon the city. With that thought in mind, I turned away from the window and began examining the rest of the cabin. Most people seemed too preoccupied with watching the landing preparations or preparing themselves for whatever lay beyond these doors to notice. For some reason, however, something kept drawing my gaze toward one particular man who occupied his own row. His presence was overpowering, yet subtle, almost ghost-like in nature. What did he want? Why couldn't I get him out of my mind? Once landed, I collected my baggage from the conveyor belt. Before heading towards customs, I paused for a moment, glancing back at the gate attendant's booth. That same stranger stood motionless amongst the crowd. I smiled slightly to myself, glad to know someone here didn't seem quite right in the head. Much like me. I wished I got a better look at his face before being ushered away by the chaperoning professors. Something about that man seemed so familiar, and it bugged me that I could not put my finger on what. I decided to stop worrying about things until later, since there wouldn't be any time left once we reached Giza. There are times when one has to trust one's instincts, even if they don't make sense to anyone else but oneself. That night I felt watched in my hotel room, as though someone from the outside could see me from 30 stories high. I knew this to be impossible, but still kept the blinds closed in case. My dreams weren't very pleasant either. They had nothing to do with Egypt, but more with the mysterious stranger from the airplane. We talked together in strange tongues, which I neither understood nor spoke fluently, but somehow communicated nonetheless. All throughout my dreamscape travels, I saw him staring straight at me, no matter where we went, always watching me closely while I walked down narrow paths shrouded in mist and up steep hillsides covered in lush greenery. Each time I woke up, I found myself feeling strangely refreshed and relaxed, despite having barely slept at all. When morning came, I was the first at roll call. Usually they went in alphabetical order, but the lazy professors took stock of us by our faces instead. Of course, they knew Maris Latour's, me, their star student, would be the first to check in. Slowly, the rest of the students shuffled in. There was some still unaccounted for, but they informed us that was no matter. Only a few could go to the site at a time, and they had already split us up into groups. My heart raced in the hope that I was among the first who would go. After all, how many chances will one ever have to visit ancient sites in person? In addition to my professor friends, local guides who showed us the way to our destination accompanied us to an area known as Giza Plateau. Unsure of whether from the heat or jet lag, I stumbled on my feet after exiting the bus. A wave of nausea crashed over me and I had to grab onto the steel handle for support. It forced me to pause and take a few steadying breaths, blink away the bright, glaring blur of my surroundings. I was uncoordinated, sure, but that was the first time I had ever truly experienced vertigo. The sheer size of everything around me made me feel insignificant, vulnerable. At least, that's what it felt like. From afar, the pyramids looked just like giant rocks sitting atop the earth, but close up they were much different. Not only were they huge, each one boasted its own distinct shape and color. Some resembled rectangular stones stacked one above another, others resembled pyramid-shaped spires, while some were merely circular depressions in the ground. Many of them appeared eroded by wind and sand. I could not help the overwhelming sense of déjà vu as I looked about the site. I had been here before, yet the farthest I had ever traveled was to New York. This place, without knowing why, sent shivers down my spine. With every step, I became more aware of the vastness of the desert surrounding me, the mountains towering in the distance and the silence that filled the air. Nothing moved save the occasional bird flying overhead or the fluttering wings of insects crawling along the sandy dunes. Even the sun itself hovered low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. Giddiness and dread went to war within me. I was overexcited about finally stepping into an ancient past, but I could not shake the nagging sense that something was off. I snuck away from the group to explore the tomb of Pharaoh Khufu alone. Despite being labeled open, the entrance proved difficult to find. Finally, I managed to locate the right path through the winding corridors of rock and stone until I arrived at the burial chamber. Once inside, however, I quickly realized there was nobody else present. I retraced my steps but could find no one. I figured they were bound to join me at some point and took the time to study my surroundings, a golden opportunity to take it all in without the noise of unappreciative tourists. I took a slow walk back to the burial chamber and paused when I spotted a small opening near the ceiling. Something caught my eye, a crack in the wall that led upwards towards the heavens. Curiosity got the better of me and I began climbing the stairs carved into the walls. On reaching the top floor, I peered out through the gap between two pillars, trying to make out anything beyond. That was something new. None of the other archaeologists documented anything of the sort. The idea of a student discovering a secret passage spurred me forward. To my surprise, I discovered that the room beyond opened out onto a narrow staircase leading downwards into darkness. What did this mean? Did these passages connect underground? Had they always existed underfoot, hiding in plain sight? If so, what secrets lay beneath the sands of the Egyptian desert? The further down I walked, the less I could see. I had to rely on my other senses and ram my hand against the stone wall for support. Caution was paramount, especially for someone like me. I had no way of knowing how far down the stairs reached. I knew that if something were to go wrong, I would be a mummy myself before anyone found me. That was enough to deter anyone else, but not me. I was too determined to discover what lay ahead. Too curious, and maybe even foolish. There was little chance I'd survive, but nothing ventured, nothing gained, as people said. Right now, though, I couldn't think of any sensible reason to turn back. So I pressed onward, downward deeper still. When I heard a faint whirring sound below me, I stopped dead in my tracks. My brow furrowed in confusion. There was no way they could have fit any sort of heavy machinery down such narrow stairs. If anyone else had ventured this way, there would have been more light. More signs of modern man's presence. My heart tightened in my chest with every aching beat as I drew nearer. It wasn't hard to guess where this was going. Either someone had built the machine themselves using tools from our era, which meant whoever used it probably came after us, or this thing belonged to somebody who lived during the time of pharaohs. Either way, things weren't looking good. I stumbled on the last step, not expecting them to end so abruptly, and hurt my ankle in the process. My hissing and growling from the pain echoed back at me, harmonized with the loud whirring noise. I noticed an ethereal blue light up ahead and limped slowly toward it. The closer I got, the stronger the glow became, filling my vision with a dazzling brightness. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that the source of the light was coming from the flicker of hieroglyphics I had never seen before. The sound emanated from those odd symbols. I edged closer, and upon further examination, found that they were, in fact, buttons that protruded from the wall. My jaw slackened as I studied the strange phenomenon. There were theories that unearthly visitors designed and helped build the pyramids, but there was never any concrete proof. I didn't know why I thought they might have done it, but somehow I felt that this discovery made perfect sense. These hieroglyphics represented a language unknown to the modern world, one that extraterrestrials probably created. They must have known we would eventually discover it and tried to leave clues about their existence behind. That seemed plausible. At least that was my thinking until I pressed a button. A bright flash of light erupted from the ground beneath my feet. Before I could react, a sharp gust of wind blew across my body, causing me to stumble backwards. It felt as though someone had placed me in the dryer. I rolled and tumbled, surrounded by the sharp white light. My hands reached out to grab onto something, but they grasped at nothing. The air in my lungs was absent as I tried to scream. I felt like I was tumbling through the rabbit hole with no end. My body hit the ground with a disconcerting thump. The force of impact left me winded and wheezing as I turned onto my side. A dry sob escaped my lips from the sharp pain as my eyes adjusted to the dark once more. I managed to prop myself up with the palms of my hands. My weakened arms shook as they tried to support the weight. I took a few more steadying breaths, then set myself upright and sat on the floor. The hieroglyphs were still there, but they no longer flickered. The noise was gone as well. It shrouded me in silence. For some reason, this all felt familiar. Like I'd been here before. That same inexplicable sense of déjà vu at the plateau. I used whatever I could in my surroundings to help me on my feet before heading back the way I came. I knew no one would believe my story unless I physically brought them down there. Although upon exiting, I noticed the structure was different. There were flaming torches mounted in the wall on either side of the passage. That was when panic started to set in. I must have hit my head in the fall, or the room was never there to begin with. Some sort of logical explanation. I'd have accepted any at that point. Whatever happened, it was clear I needed to get away from that place. Now, a dull ache began throbbing between my temples as I headed toward the stairs. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom that threatened to engulf my thoughts. I ignored the voice in my mind, telling myself I should have left well enough alone. It was no time for cowardice. I pushed forward, trying to ignore the growing dread that threatened to paralyze me with fear. Ahead, I thought I was hearing things. Men shouted at one another in a language I had never heard before. They sounded pissed off, and it was not something I wanted to get in the middle of. Thankfully, the torches extended to the stairs and I could see them clear. I tried my best to stay as quiet as possible whilst descending them. In hindsight, it was the smartest thing to do, but I had no other choice. Each step took forever, and I was losing precious minutes. I prayed that no one else was going to come down those steps. Once I finally arrived at the top, I quickly scanned the area for anything out of the ordinary. Everything looked different, as though the pyramid was still undergoing excavation or construction. The torches were much brighter now, casting the surrounding shadows into stark relief. As I got closer, the voices became louder. They spoke too fast, making it hard to understand the language. I stopped dead in my tracks as the sound of a vicious fight broke out, accompanied by the deafening boom of something breaking through the wall. What I could only describe as the clash of metal against metal followed. I always thought it stupid when witnessing someone, on the screen or in a book, in a similar situation, freeze in fear. But I did just that, staring dumbfounded as two men in what appeared to be armor engaged in combat. One was larger than the other, his broad shoulders and muscular build contrasting sharply with his opponent's slender physique. I stared, routed in place, unmoving as these men moved faster than normal humans should. The live man could match his more muscular opponent blow for blow, even kicking him across the room. I tried backing up into the shadows, the men too occupied with each other to notice me, and looked for a way around them. I flinched as the more slender male flew back against the stone wall and took some debris down with him. His opponent gave chase, and he caught the smaller man with an uppercut, sending him crashing to the floor. He rose, and with a single swipe, cleaved his sword through the air and sliced the hapless victim's throat. Blood gushed forth, pooling underneath him as he fell, lifeless, to the ground. My eyes met those of the victor. When he snarled at me, I saw 4 elongated canines bared in malice. He was on me before I could flinch in any direction and had me by the throat, raising me off the ground. I struggled uselessly, unable to draw breath. All I could manage were gasps of horror as he leaned close, his hot breath burning my skin. His brow creased as he studied me at a hair's breadth. The way his eyes shone reminded me of a predatory animal at night. He then tilted my head by force and sunk those canines into the base of my throat. The excruciating pain overtook all other senses, like thick needles stabbing into the veins and purposefully turning inside them, then repeating the action somewhere else. My heart slowed the longer he drank from me. My temples throbbed and my head felt like it would explode. When he dropped me, my body fell limp to the floor, and the last thing I saw was his back.